1830, Louisiana. Female slave takes revenge on a plantation family by feeding them the flesh of their relatives. New Orleans, Louisiana, 1830 seconds. The air in the slave quarters on the Thibodeau plantation was always damp and heavy, a mix of Mississippi River mud, salty sweat, and smoke from cooking fires. Eliza was born on the damp dirt floor of a dilapidated shack, where the thatched roof leaked every time a storm swept in from the Gulf. She never knew a day without the welt of a whip on her back or the gnawing hunger that felt like a wild beast devouring her from within. Her earliest memories were not of a mother's lullaby, but of screams from the sugarcane fields, desperate cries that faded into muffled sobs in the night. In the darkness, she would hear the scrape of iron chains on wood as men were dragged out for punishment, or the low moans of the injured trying to find sleep. From a young age, Eliza understood that life here was not measured in years, but in endurance. Before we continue with the story, please subscribe to our channel and share in the comments which state you're watching from. Do you find stories like this chilling? Thank you for letting us know. And now, back to the story. Eliza learned faster than most other children that safety meant becoming invisible. Speaking too much was dangerous. Meeting the eyes of a white master or mistress could earn a back bent beneath the whip. She carried herself small, shoulders rounded, gaze lowered, lips pressed together as though silence were the only thing keeping her alive. The adults around her never told her this directly, but she learned it from the way they moved quietly, carefully, always anticipating a blow. Her mother, Clara, worked in the big house kitchen, and that was where Eliza found her first glimpses of peace. The kitchen was filled with the scents of Creole spices, pungent cayenne pepper, fragrant bay leaves imported from distant ports, a world she could hardly imagine. On rare days, Clara would let her stand on a wooden stool, using her small hands to stir a pot of gumbo. The thick sauce clung to her fingers like a second skin, something she could control, transform unlike the rest of her life. Those moments, brief but precious, became her refuge. But the kitchen also taught her about cruelty. She saw the cook get burned by boiling oil and have to keep working, blood dripping and mixing with the meat, while the mistress, sipping tea nearby, paid no mind. Here, the smell of blood could blend with the smell of simmering meat, and no one would know. For the Thibodeau family, the kitchen was a place of indulgence. For the enslaved, it was another stage where suffering had to be swallowed. The Thibodeau big house was a place of contradictions, gleaming polished wood, crystal chandeliers, but its beauty was built on the backs of slaves. Eliza saw the master return from the city with perfumed clothes and a volatile temper, lashing out with his whip at anyone who was too slow. She saw the mistress's fake smile when guests praised her staff as if they were well-behaved pets. Eliza's life followed a harsh rhythm, stirring pots, kneading dough, picking vegetables in the garden until her hands went numb. As she grew older, she scrubbed the stone floors until her knees bled through the thin fabric of her dress. Each day was the same, yet always brought a new cruelty, an insult, a slap for being too slow, a meal withheld as punishment. Hunger became a constant companion. The weekly ration was just cornmeal and salt pork, enough to survive but not enough to feel full. Sometimes her mother would sneak her a leftover biscuit from the master's table, but it was never enough to quell the ache in her stomach. The Thibodeau children would taunt her with food, holding out a piece of praline candy, only to snatch it back with a laugh. Eliza learned not to reach, not to let them see the want in her eyes. At night, she lay on her thin mat, listening to the sounds around her, the restless shuffling in the crowded shack, the coughs of the sick, the creak of the door when the overseer made his rounds. Sometimes from the big house, she would hear muffled cries of a woman or a child. Those sounds made her cover her ears and bite her lip until it bled. She didn't understand all the reasons, but she understood fear, the kind that seeps into your bones, becoming part of you until you can't tell where it ends and you begin. Her mother tried to shield her, teaching her tricks for survival, how to hide a scrap of food in her apron, how to keep her face expressionless when being yelled at, how to remember the names and uses of the herbs in the garden, both those for healing and those whispered to be for other purposes. A quiet mouth and quick hands, Clara would whisper. That's how you live. Eliza obeyed. She became invisible in plain sight, a shadow gliding through the kitchen, a pair of hands working without complaint. The Thibodeau family hardly noticed her to them. She was just a tool, like the broom in the corner or the pots hanging from the rafters. But in that invisibility lay power. She moved without a sound, overheard things not meant for her, and learned the rhythms of the house. She knew who liked which dish, which door creaked, where the keys hung. She knew where the mistress hid her silver and where the master kept his liquor. She recognized the footsteps of each family member. She gathered this knowledge like seeds, not knowing what for. Her mother once said that seeds can lie dormant for years and still sprout when the time is right. Eliza's early life was shaped by two truths. She was powerless, and she had to survive. She didn't yet know a day would come when those truths would shift, when survival would no longer mean obedience, but something else entirely. For now, she was silent. She kept her head down, her hands busy, her thoughts her own. But deep inside, in a place no whip could reach, something was taking root. It wasn't yet anger, not yet a plan, only the understanding that nothing on the Thibodeau plantation was sacred, and a life could be taken as easily as a piece of bread from a child's plate. And in the kitchen, as she watched meat simmering over the fire and smelled the coppery tang in the air, she understood something else. The line between food and human flesh was thinner than most dared to believe. That knowledge, once learned, could never be unlearned. It would stay with her, quiet and patient, like a seed in the dark, waiting for its season to come. By the time Eliza turned 18, the kitchen had become both her prison and her domain. Her mother, Clara, had grown weak with age. Her back was permanently bent from hauling heavy loads. Her hands trembled when she stirred the pots. When her legs could no longer bear the heat from the hearth, the Thibodeaus moved her to the laundry. The decision was made without a shred of sentiment. The very next morning, Eliza was ordered to take her mother's place as the family cook. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of the skills passed down to her. Only the command to serve without error, without rest, and without a voice. From that day on, Eliza rose at dawn, stepping into the big house while the plantation still slept. Her life became an endless cycle. Chopping, simmering, baking, cleaning. Every dish was inspected by the mistress. Every pot of gumbo judged for its spice and thickness. There was no praise, only criticism if something wasn't to her liking. Eliza learned to move like a machine, stirring a pot while chopping meat, listening for the creak of the pantry door. Her hands were always busy, her mouth always shut. In those years, her husband, Jacob, a strong slave from the fields, became her only joy. They were secretly married under an old oak tree, and he brought a small warmth to her world of shadows. Jacob was quick-witted and had a quiet strength. He would tell her stories of the river and a distant life of freedom. His presence made the endless labor feel less like servitude and more like survival. Eliza clung to the hope that somehow they could endure together, protecting each other from the worst the plantation could inflict. But protection was fragile on the Thibodeau estate. When Eliza was 25, she began to notice the way Master Thibodeau and his son lingered in the kitchen at night. They would appear under flimsy pretexts, a request for coffee, a craving for a biscuit, leaning casually against the table as their eyes fixed on her with lecherous smiles. Sometimes they would call her into the pantry alone, their voices low and coaxing. Eliza began positioning herself between them and their line of sight, speaking only when necessary, her body an unspoken barrier. But she couldn't be everywhere at once, and the Thibodeau men were raised to believe that nothing in the slave quarters or the kitchen was beyond their reach. One sweltering summer evening in 1845, the day's heat still clinging to the walls long after sunset, Eliza was in the kitchen, stirring a large pot of gumbo for dinner. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the smell of burnt rue and Creole spices. She was focused on her work when a drunken Master Thibodeau entered and grabbed her arm. At that exact moment, Jacob entered from the back door, saw the scene, and rushed forward, trying to push the master away. The brief struggle ended with the crack of a whip and the brutal thud of a wooden club from the overseer who had followed behind. Jacob was beaten to death, his body collapsing onto the kitchen floor. His blood pooled, mixing with the dark red of the simmering gumbo nearby. The overseer, who had delivered the final blow, stood panting. Master Thibodeau, slightly sobered by the struggle, simply wiped his hands on his shirt and sneered. It dared to touch its master. That smirk said everything. There would be no justice. There would be no accusation. If she spoke up, the punishment would not fall on them, but on her or her mother. The master walked past her without a word. The faint smell of bourbon clung to him as he disappeared into the hallway. Eliza's hands trembled as she knelt beside her husband. Jacob's body was still warm to her touch, but his breath was gone. Eliza did not cry in front of them. She didn't need to. She cradled his body, holding it tight, gently rocking him, whispering a final farewell that only he and the darkness could hear. She stayed there until they dragged his body away, until the blood on the floor was hastily wiped, leaving a dark, faint stain in the lantern light. That night, Eliza did not close her eyes. She sat on the mat in her empty shack, her back against the wall, listening to the night sounds of the plantation. Every sound seemed sharper. Every creak of the floorboards above was a reminder that the Thibodeaux slept soundly in their beds, untroubled and unpunished. In the stillness, something inside her changed. It was not a sudden burst of rage, but a deep, cold current that settled in her chest and would not move. By morning, the mask had returned to her face. She rose before dawn, washed her hands, tied her apron, and stepped into the kitchen as if nothing had happened. The Thibodeaux family expected breakfast beignets, bacon, coffee, and she brought it to them with quiet efficiency. No one noticed that her eyes lingered a moment too long on the eldest son as she placed the plate before him, the one who had stood laughing as Jacob died. No one saw the way her jaw tightened when he smiled at her as if she were invisible. Inside, however, Eliza was no longer the same. The woman who had once accepted her place in silence had begun to change. The helplessness she had lived with since childhood was slowly hardening into something else, something sharper, more deliberate. It was not the kind of fury that burned bright and faded. It was the kind that waited. She understood now with bone-deep clarity that the world she lived in would never give her justice. If she wanted it, she would have to take it herself. And so she began to think quietly, secretly, while her hands stirred pots and chopped vegetables. She thought about the kitchen, about how the Thibodeaux trusted her food without question. She thought about the strong Creole spices that could hide almost anything if seasoned just right. She thought about the teachings of her grandmother, about the herbs from the swamp, about the curses whispered on the wind, how to simmer meat in a gumbo until no one could recognize where it came from. She did not yet have a plan, but she had time, and she had patience. Most of all, she had the memory of Jacob's pool of blood on the kitchen floor, a memory that would not fade no matter how many pots of soup she cooked or meals she served. That memory was a blade, and she would keep it sharp. The Thibodeaux family continued their lives as if nothing had changed. They laughed at their dinner table, made plans for parties, and spoke carelessly about the sugarcane harvest and the market. But in the kitchen, where Eliza's hands shaped every bite they ate, the air had begun to shift. There was no outward sign, only the faint, invisible chill that came from a woman who had decided she would never again be powerless. Her revenge did not begin with fire or noise. It began with the kind of silence that slips into a room unnoticed, curling itself into the corners, patient and certain. Eliza had spent years perfecting silence. It was her shield, her language, and her weapon. Now, it would be how she killed. The first to disappear was the master's eldest son, the one who had laughed at Jacob's death. He had always been the most brazen of them, the one who strutted through the slave quarters with his hands in his pockets and a smirk on his lips. He was the one who looked at the enslaved girls as if they weren't people at all, just possessions waiting to be used. And on this particular night, he came into the kitchen drunk, his boots tracking mud across the floor she had just scrubbed, his voice loud enough to make the lanterns tremble on their hooks. He reeked of bourbon, his eyes glassy, his words tumbling out with the sloppy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He leaned against the table, watching her stir a pot of gumbo, and began muttering about Jacob, about how that buck had gotten what he deserved. His grin widened as he spoke, the memory feeding some dark satisfaction in him. Eliza's hands did not falter as she stirred the pot, but inside her chest something turned to stone. She did not argue, did not shout, did not even look at him. Instead, she moved to the stove, her movements smooth and unhurried, as though his presence meant nothing to her. From a smaller pot, she ladled out a bowl of hot soup, the simmered meat already tender, its fibers falling apart in the rich, spicy broth. She worked with the calm precision of a woman who had made this dish 1,000 times before. The bowl of soup was served quickly. The broth was dark, thick, topped with a sprinkle of chopped green onions. The smell of the spices was intense, promising warmth and familiarity. His favorite. She set the bowl before him on the table, the steam rising, the aroma filling the air. He dug in greedily, shoveling spoonfuls into his mouth, his eyes closing in brief pleasure. "Best you've ever made," he mumbled through a mouthful. She gave him the smallest of smiles, just enough for him to think she cared. He ate until the bowl was clean, until the sauce was smeared at the corners of his lips, and then he rose unsteadily, muttering something about getting some air. He left the kitchen with the slow swagger of the inebriated, his boots echoing down the hallway. Eliza stood very still, listening to the fading sound of his steps. That night, the Thibodeau son did not return to his bed. The house awoke to whispers the next morning, the servants glancing at one another with wide eyes. The master's voice boomed through the halls, demanding to know where his son had gone. The mistress clutched her robe and said perhaps he had gone down to New Orleans for some fun. He was known to disappear for a night or two when liquor got the better of him. No one came to the kitchen to ask Eliza. She was just the cook. Breakfast was served on time, the chicory coffee strong, the beignets hot and soft. The family ate, though the table felt smaller without him. No one noticed Eliza's gaze linger for a moment on the empty chair before she turned back to her work. By evening, the matter was already fading from conversation. The Thibodeaus believed that missing sons always came back eventually, and they had other matters to occupy them. Only the servants noticed how Eliza stayed in the kitchen very late that night, beside the large simmering pot. The door was closed tight behind her. Inside, the air was hot, humid, and dark, the fire from the hearth casting her shadow on the stone walls. On the table were jars of spices and bundles of dried herbs she had secretly gathered from the edge of the swamp. The broth in the pot bubbled, its aroma heavy in the still air. The meat inside had disintegrated, indistinguishable, blended into the rich, spicy sauce, seasoned to perfection. Eliza worked with deliberate care, adding each herb, whispering the words her grandmother had taught her, words that only she and the spirits of the swamp understood. She did not smile. She did not need to. Somewhere out in the night, the bullfrogs croaked and the insects chirped, the sounds of life indifferent to what had been taken. But in the hot, humid kitchen, Eliza knew a truth the Thibodeaus did not. Their son was not coming back, and by the time they began to wonder, it would be far too late. Her hands stirred the stew with a slow, almost reverent motion, as if she were performing an ancient ritual. Each stir was an offering, not to the Thibodeaus, but to the memory of Jacob's pool of blood, to every moment she had bitten her tongue instead of screaming, to every humiliation swallowed in silence. She had fed them her pain for years in the form of soup and bread. Now she would feed them something else entirely. When she stepped out of the kitchen, the humid night air clung to her like a second skin. The big house loomed in the distance, its windows glowing warmly, oblivious. She walked back toward her shack without hurry, her steps steady, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. From this night forward, there would be no turning back. It became a rhythm, quiet, precise, deliberate. Eliza moved through her days with the same calm efficiency she always had. But beneath that still surface, a dark pulse kept steady time. Every few months, someone connected to the Thibodeau name would simply vanish. There was no pattern that could be traced by the living, no chain that could be seen by the untrained eye. But Eliza knew the truth. She was linking each disappearance like curses in a voodoo chant, one after another, tightening it around the family's throat. The first after the eldest son was a visiting uncle, a notoriously cruel man. He treated the enslaved as a stage for his arrogance, barking orders at them as if the Thibodeau plantation were his to command. He had a particular fondness for mocking Eliza's quiet demeanor, trying to force her into answering his crude remarks. One evening, he decided to inspect the kitchen before dinner, knocking over a pot of vegetables she was preparing onto the floor with a laugh. She said nothing. She simply served him his dinner later, a bowl of gumbo with a perfectly dark roux, the aroma rich enough to make him close his eyes in pleasure. He never saw the dawn. Months later, it was an older uncle, one of the Thibodeau elders who had been instrumental in disciplining the slave quarters in years past. Eliza remembered clearly the night he had stood on the veranda and watched while her mother was dragged into the yard and beaten. He had smoked his cigar, his eyes cold, his mouth curved into the faintest smirk. When his time came, he too received a bowl of gumbo. This one she seasoned more heavily, her hands stirring the pot slowly, almost tenderly, as though the spices were a shroud she was tucking around him. And then came the overseer. For years, he had been the embodiment of cruelty on the plantation. His whip had split more backs than she could count, his voice a bark of constant threat. He was the one who had swung the final club at Jacob, striking him until he lay still on the ground. Eliza's hatred for him was colder than any she had felt for the Thibodeaus themselves. His end was planned with special care. She prepared his gumbo with a patience that bordered on reverence, simmering the meat for hours until it fell apart, adding the most potent herbs, the most bitter whispered curses. He devoured it with his usual greed, never knowing it would be his last meal. With each death, her confidence grew. She refined her methods like a mambo, voodoo priestess, perfecting a ritual. The seasoning was always exact. Enough cayenne and bay leaf to mask any unfamiliar undertone, enough rich roux to dissolve the meat so that no one could question its origin. She experimented with herbs, sometimes adding a root to cause mild hallucinations, other times a leaf to bring on a deep, unwaking sleep. Every pot of gumbo was a masterpiece, a work of art that only she and her victims would ever truly understand. She worked in silence, but her mind was never still. As she stirred the pot, she would hum softly, tunelessly, low, like a curse for herself. Her hands were steady, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the kitchen walls. It was as if with each pot of gumbo, she was building a bridge from the past to a future where Jacob's death would not go unanswered. She did not rush. Revenge, she had learned, was like a good stock. It was better when simmered slowly. People in the town and on neighboring plantations began to speak of her with admiration. At large parties, at gatherings, her gumbo became a small legend. The Thibodeau cook has magic in her hands, they'd say with a smile, their voices carrying that mix of awe and envy reserved for those who could transform simple ingredients into something extraordinary. Some whispered she must have a secret Creole recipe, something handed down through generations. Others joked that she could make even alligator meat taste good. No one noticed the strange satisfaction that curved her lips whenever she overheard their praise. No one wondered why she never accepted offers to cook for other households, why her gumbo was always made in the Thibodeau kitchen and never anywhere else. The secret was in the control, the space, the tools, and the herbs that only grew on the edge of the plantation's swamp. She could not risk losing that. Even the Thibodeaus, superstitious as they were, seemed blind to the pattern. Deaths and disappearances were explained away as accidents, yellow fever, or runaways. An uncle might have gone to try his luck in the city. The overseer, they assumed, had been killed by robbers on the road. The family grieved in their own shallow way, murmuring prayers and wearing black for the appropriate period before life returned to its normal rhythms. Eliza served them their meals through it all, her face calm, her hands clean, her apron white. What they could not see was that their normal was her hunting ground. Every interaction, every request, every moment in the kitchen was an opportunity to measure their weaknesses. She knew who drank too much to notice a change in taste, who prided themselves on their hearty appetites, who would never refuse her gumbo because they believed themselves too important to suspect a cook. Between the disappearances, she lived as though nothing had changed. She rose before dawn, tended the fires, prepared breakfast. She attended to the mundane needs of the household, mending torn aprons, scrubbing floors, preparing vegetables. She nodded softly at the mistress's small talk, bowed her head politely to the master's commands. But behind her eyes, she was always watching, always calculating. The rhythm of her work was almost musical, the steady chop of a knife through vegetables, the low hiss of sauce bubbling in the pot, the thud of a pestle grinding spices in a mortar. It was in these sounds that she found her center, her control. She had no need for anger now. Anger was a blunt instrument, and she preferred the precision of a curse. She kept her herbs dry and her whispers secret. The kitchen became her sanctuary, its humid heat wrapping around her like an embrace. It was there she prepared the stews that would become her next offering. There she stood among the hanging jars of spices, the air thick with the scent of secrets and ancient power. The kitchen knew her truth and kept it. Months bled into years, and still the pattern held. Each death was spaced just far enough apart to avoid suspicion, each one masked by the endless churn of plantation life. The sugarcane needed planting, then harvesting. The seasons turned. New faces appeared among the enslaved. Old ones vanished. The Thibodeaus busied themselves with business deals, parties, and church events, and Eliza, the quiet constant in their kitchen, remained overlooked. She took a certain pleasure in that invisibility. It was her shield and her power. She could stand in the center of the room, stirring a pot of gumbo, while the family spoke freely about their affairs, never imagining she was listening, never imagining she might have already decided which of them would be next. The more they praised her cooking, the more they sealed their fate. "Best gumbo in Louisiana," one of the surviving relatives declared after dinner, scraping his bowl clean. "Don't know what we'd do without her." Eliza smiled politely, meeting his eyes for just a moment longer than necessary. In that instant, she knew she would not have to imagine what they'd do without her. She would show them. To the town, she was the Thibodeau cook, the quiet woman with the gifted hands. To the Thibodeau, she was a servant too loyal to ever betray them. But to herself, she had become something else entirely, a mambo with infinite patience, turning her vengeance into a sacred ritual, feeding her enemies their own destruction. And as long as the pattern held, as long as she kept her rhythm, no one would see the curse tightening until it was too late. By 1850, the Thibodeau estate seemed to exude unease. The grandeur of its moss-draped oaks and wide verandas had not changed, but there was something in the air, a weight, a stillness that had not been there before. At night, the old wooden floors groaned under invisible steps. Doors that had once shut tight creaked open on their own, and the faintest drafts curled through the halls like spirits searching for something lost. In the slave quarters, the servants whispered of a voodoo curse that had taken root in the family. They spoke in low voices when the Thibodeaus were out of earshot, trading stories of the ones who had vanished, wondering who would be next. By day, life on the plantation went on. The sugarcane was still harvested, the accounts still balanced, and the Thibodeaux still entertained guests who commented politely on the estate's elegance. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, tension hummed in the walls. Even the family's laughter at the dinner table carried an edge, as though each of them was trying to convince themselves they still believed in their own safety. Eliza felt that tension in every step she took. She had become as much a part of the house as its moss-draped oaks and bricks, always present, always working, yet rarely acknowledged. She moved with the silence of someone who knew every inch of the estate by heart, which floorboards groaned under weight, which doors stuck in damp weather, which rooms the Thibodeaus avoided after dark. Her invisibility was her shield. She could pass through a room, her eyes lowered, her hands busy, and hear the conversations they thought she couldn't understand. She caught the fragments, their worry about a curse, their muttered prayers, the occasional sharp accusation thrown at one another when tempers frayed. In those moments, she knew the fear was working its way under their skin exactly as she had intended. The mistress of the house, once a sharp-tongued woman whose voice could cut as clean as any blade, had grown pale and thin. Her movements had slowed, her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. She began watching Eliza with an intensity that could almost be felt, her gaze following her as she worked in the kitchen or passed through the dining room. It was not the watchfulness of authority, it was something closer to paranoia. She had no proof, nothing she could put into words, and the rules of her own world bound her tongue. Accusing a servant of voodoo magic without evidence was to risk appearing insane, and the mistress valued her reputation too much for that. But Eliza felt the weight of those eyes on her, and she met them with the same calm mask she had worn since childhood. If the mistress searched her face for guilt, she would find only the stillness of a woman who had learned to survive by revealing nothing. In the kitchen, life followed its own rhythm. The heat from the hearth wrapped the room in a constant haze of warmth, the air thick with the scents of Creole spices, herbs, and simmering meat. Eliza worked alone, with quiet dedication. The years had taken the softness from her face, replacing it with something sharper, more guarded. She had long since stopped speaking to the Thibodeaus, except when necessary. Her words, when they came, were clipped and formal, her tone stripped of warmth. Eliza had inherited her mother's skill with spice and fire, and more than that, she had inherited her grandmother's understanding of silence and curses. She learned to let her hands speak for her, how to measure cayenne by a glance, how to stir a pot without letting her eyes stray toward the family who ate from it. She learned how to move through the house unseen, how to notice without being noticed, how to hold onto a truth without ever speaking it aloud. She worked in a deadly harmony with her purpose. She would be preparing a broth while chopping vegetables for the next dish. She would tend the fire while whispering curses into the pot of meat. And always in that silent space, there was an unspoken understanding of what her work meant. The gumbos were not just food, they were the slow, methodical weaving of justice. Each pot another curse in the ritual that was wrapping itself around the Thibodeau name. Outside the kitchen, the whispers of the servants grew bolder. They called it the voodoo curse, a shadow from the swamp that walked with the Thibodeaus, taking them one by one. Some said the family must have angered the low spirits. Others claimed it was the restless spirits of those they had wronged. Eliza never encouraged the talk, but she never discouraged it either. Fear, she knew, was as effective a weapon as any knife. It softened the ground, made it easier for her work to take root. At night, when the fires had died down and the house was quiet, she would sometimes walk the halls, her steps light, her presence barely more than a breath. She knew how to make the floorboards speak just enough to be heard, how to let the faint scent of Creole spices drift into a room where someone lay half awake. If the Thibodeaus thought the house itself had turned against them, so much the better. By now, the family's distrust was no longer confined to the servants. It had begun to turn inward. She could see it in the way they glanced at one another across the table, in the way their conversations cut off abruptly when a third person entered the room. They had started to count the empty chairs, to notice the spaces left behind by those who were gone, and each time another name was added to the list, their unease deepened. Eliza kept her hands steady and her face neutral, but inside, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan unfolding exactly as it should. They thought they were haunted by fate, by a curse from the swamp, by something beyond human control. They were wrong. What stalked them was not a Loa, but a woman who had learned to call their names, slipping through their lives like a shadow, leaving no trace but the empty places they could not explain. The Thibodeau estate had indeed become haunted, though not by the dead. It was haunted by the living, by the cook who passed them their food with lowered eyes, by the fear they could neither name nor escape. And as long as Eliza moved like a ghost through their halls, the haunting would not end. The last one left was the mistress, Madame Thibodeau, the woman who had ruled her family and her house with a cold silence, a woman who believed her position was unshakable. Age had carved deep lines into her face, but it had not softened her. She still walked with an air of nobility, each step a reminder to the slaves that they existed at her pleasure. To Eliza, she was the root of the silent complicity, the woman whose indifference to cruelty had been an unspoken command. If the Thibodeau name was to end, it had to end with her. It was in the first damp days of winter when she decided the time had come. The nights were chilly, the air carrying the scent of wet moss and smoke from the fireplaces. Madame Thibodeau had been keeping to her parlor more often, grumbling about her headaches, sipping glasses of sherry late into the evening. She still dined at the family table, but now she was almost always alone. The absences were too many, the conversations non-existent. One evening, Eliza appeared at her door with a quiet suggestion. "A special supper just for you, mistress," she said, her tone deferential, her eyes lowered. The mistress looked at her for a long moment, perhaps remembering the years she had worked in her kitchen without protest, perhaps thinking that she was the last loyal servant. She agreed with a tired nod, not knowing that she had just accepted her final invitation. The kitchen was warm that night, the hearth casting a golden glow on the worn copper pots. Eliza worked with the care of a mambo in a ritual, her movements measured and precise. The roux was simmered to a perfect dark brown, its surface shimmering under the firelight. The gumbo was rich and fragrant, the meat so tender it melted after hours of preparation, the seasoning exact, enough to create depth, enough to hide the truth. She added the final, most potent herbs to the pot, watching the steam rise. mingling with the pungent scent of cayenne pepper she had deliberately added, knowing it would linger in the memory. When it was ready, she did not serve the mistress in the dining room. Instead, she invited her to a smaller table in the kitchen itself, one she had scrubbed until it shone. She told her the warmth of the hearth would be better for her headaches, and the mistress seemed to appreciate the gesture of concern. She placed the bowl of gumbo before her, the steam still rising, the dark red of the broth catching the flicker of the lantern light. The mistress took the first spoonful with a tired sigh, the rich broth spilling into her spoon, and she took the first bite with the weary air of a woman who had lost everything but still believed she was entitled to be served. "You have stayed loyal all these years," she said between spoonfuls, her voice weak but still haughty. "The others have run off or died of plague, but not you." She shook her head. "A good cook is the only thing left." Eliza stood beside her, hands folded neatly in front of her, her face calm. The lantern light swayed gently as a draft slipped through the room, the shadows stretching and contracting across the walls. She waited until the mistress was halfway through her bowl before leaning closer. Her voice was low, almost tender, as she spoke the words she had carried for years. "You've eaten them all, mistress." The spoon froze halfway to the woman's mouth. She swallowed slowly, her eyes lifting to Eliza's in something between confusion and dawning realization. Eliza did not give her the satisfaction of an explanation. She turned and walked away, her steps measured, her back straight, leaving the woman in the pool of flickering light with the weight of her words settling over her. What passed through her mind in those moments? Eliza never knew whether she tried to rise from the table, whether she stared down at the bowl and thought of each missing face. It was no longer her concern. By the time the night gave way to dawn, Madame Thibaudot was gone. The family woke to a peculiar stillness. The fire in the parlor had burned low to ash. The mistress's chair was empty. The servants moved quietly, their eyes avoiding one another, their hands busy with the motions of mourning. No one asked Eliza where she was. No one mentioned the supper the night before. By mid-morning, the news had spread in hushed tones. The mistress was dead. There was no public outcry, no demand for an inquest. The Thibaudots had been losing their grip on their own story for years now. The mistress's death was simply the final blow. The remaining family members gathered in corners, whispering about wills and debts, their voices brittle with fear. Through it all, the scent of cayenne pepper lingered in the air. It clung to the rafters of the kitchen, to the fabric of Eliza's dress, to the very walls of the house. It was a spicy, almost familiar smell, and yet, for those who knew, even if they could not admit it, it carried something sharper beneath, a reminder that spice can hide the most bitter truths. Eliza went about her work as she always had. She cooked soup, baked bread, swept the floors. She moved alone with quiet efficiency, her hands working in harmony with a purpose now fulfilled. She did not speak of the night before. She didn't need to. The Thibaudot name had been swallowed piece by piece, and now there was nothing left to consume. For Eliza, it was not triumph she felt, nor even relief. It was a settling, a quiet, steady knowledge that the circle had closed. The kitchen, once a place where she had been forced to serve those who had taken everything from her, was now hers in a way it had never been before. She had fed them their own sins, and they had thanked her for it. That was enough. And in the quiet corners of the estate, where the wind slipped through cracks in the walls, the smell of cayenne pepper would remain long after the Thibaudots were gone. The scent of a curse, pungent but persistent, marking the place where justice had been served in a dark rue, and whispers from the swamp. Within weeks, the Thibaudot estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, had the hollow echo of an abandoned shell. The grand room stood half-furnished, the floors gathering dust where polished shoes had once clicked. The laughter that had spilled across the verandas during summer gatherings was gone, replaced by the sigh of wind through warped shutters. The servants who remained moved like ghosts, their duties reduced to clearing what little the family had left behind. The relatives who came to collect the last valuables did so quickly, their eyes darting to corners as if the house itself might turn against them. The whispers spread faster than the truth ever could. They called it bad luck, a voodoo curse, divine punishment. No one in town spoke openly of the chain of disappearances, but no one could ignore them either. The Thibaudot name, once uttered with respect or fear, had become a warning. Guests stopped calling, predators began circling, and so, with little left to hold on to, the remaining kin sold the property, eager to be rid of the place. For Eliza, the collapse was not an ending, but an opportunity. In the chaos of the estate being sold off, she led a few other slaves to escape in the dead of night, following the swamp trails that only she knew. They blended into the community of free people of color in New Orleans, where stories and faces could easily disappear. In the city, life was different. The air was thick with the smell of roasted coffee and jasmine instead of mud and fear. Eliza was no longer a cook. She took on odd jobs, laundry, cleaning, whatever she could to live anonymously. She no longer stood over a fire, no longer stirred the large stews that had defined her years on the plantation. The people she met now were strangers, people she had no quarrel with, and she did not cook for them. No more whispered curses, no more spices meant to hide the truth. Her hands still remembered the motions of her old craft, but she no longer felt the pull to use them for anything more than survival. The work was honest in its own way, free from the weight of the past. There was no vengeance to be had here, but there was also freedom, no reason to hide her identity. Eliza adapted to her new life slowly. She moved through the city with the same silence her mother had taught her, but without the tension of watching for the Thibodeau's footsteps. She spoke a little more now, her voice soft but steady, and sometimes a smile would touch her lips, no longer edged with bitterness. Eliza often found herself looking out at the river, measuring its currents against the memory of who she used to be. She was no longer the trembling woman beside her husband's body, nor the guarded cook living under constant threat. She was still shaped by the years on the plantation, but she was also something new, someone who had survived, and who carried that survival without shame. For Eliza, revenge had been a necessity, a voodoo fire that had kept her alive when despair might have claimed her. It had given her purpose, sharpened her patience, and given her the power to take back in her own way what had been stolen. She had taken from the Thibodeaus the same three things they had stolen from her: family, safety, and innocence. And in doing so, she had closed the circle. Yet, revenge was not a thing that could be savored forever. Once the last curse was uttered, the ritual was complete. She found herself in the quiet after, a place where there were no more targets, no more plans to weave in the shadows. Some nights she lay awake, the sounds of the city outside her window replacing the croaking of the swamp frogs and the creak of the plantation's wooden beams. She would think of the kitchen, of the bubbling pots of gumbo, of the moment she whispered the truth into Madame Thibodeau's ear. And then she would turn her thoughts away, not out of regret, but because she refused to live chained to what was already done. The past remained with her, as all pasts do. It lived in the small habits she could not break, the way she always took notice of the herbs growing on the roadside, the way her eyes scanned a room before she entered. It lived in her silence, in the way she could let a conversation pass around her without needing to take part, but it no longer burned. It was an ember now, warm but contained. In the city, the story of the Thibodeaus was told and retold, shifting with each telling. Some made it a tale of financial ruin, others of yellow fever or scandal. A few, in hushed tones, hinted at a voodoo curse from the swamp. Eliza never listened closely. The truth belonged to her, and she saw no reason to share it. Let them keep their ghost stories, their talk of curses. The real Mambo had walked away in plain sight, wearing a simple dress and carrying a basket of laundry. Her life was quieter now, and in that quiet, there was a strange kind of peace. The streets of New Orleans did not carry the weight of old grudges. The people she met sometimes smiled at her, and she would nod in return, accepting their friendliness as one might accept a passing breeze. She was no longer invisible out of necessity. She was invisible by choice. There were moments, especially on hot summer nights, when she would catch the faint scent of cayenne pepper in the air, though she had not cooked in years. It was a ghost of a smell, a reminder of what had been, and it would make her pause for a heartbeat before returning to her work. She never asked herself if it was real. Some memories cling to the senses long after they have passed, and she knew better than to question the ones that had shaped her. In the end, Eliza did not see herself as victorious, nor as defeated. She was simply still here, walking the streets of New Orleans, breathing the same free air, no longer waiting for the sound of boots in the hall. That was enough. And though the Thibodeau estate now stood empty, its windows boarded and its grounds overgrown, She knew that in the bones of the house, in the oaks that had watched generations rise and fall, there lingered the echo of her footsteps, not the steps of a servant, but of the ghost who had walked its halls unseen, delivering justice in a dark rue and curses from the swamp. Her work was done, the hunger that had driven her for years was gone, and in its place was the simple, quiet truth of survival, a truth she would carry until the end of her days. Years after Eliza's death, when the Thibodeau estate had long been left to rot, a lost hunter stumbled onto the property and found an old cast-iron pot covered in vines near where the kitchen once stood. Inside, beneath a layer of mud and leaves, was a collection of tarnished silver spoons. Each was engraved with a name from the Thibodeau family. The list matched to the last name every member who had vanished. In the back streets of New Orleans, the story grew into legend. Old women rocking on their porches in the evening heat would speak in low tones of the quiet cook who had simmered the entire Thibodeau clan into her own soup. They called her the Gumbo Witch, their voices carrying a mix of fear and admiration. And on certain summer nights, when the air is still and heavy, those who pass the crumbling ruins of the Thibodeau plantation claim they can smell cayenne pepper drifting from where the old kitchen once stood. Pungent at first, but beneath it, something darker, metallic, and impossible to forget. What do you think of this story? Leave your comments below. If you liked this story and want more chilling tales like this, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves a good mystery. See you in the next video.